Picture a nuclear power plant going completely dark, not because of a safety failure, not because of a political decision, but because the river next to it simply doesn't have enough water flowing through it anymore. That's exactly what happened in Hungary. Its sole nuclear power plant was fully shut down for the first time ever, and the reason was record low water levels on the Danube River. Not sabotage, not a grid failure, a river running dry. And Hungary isn't alone in feeling this squeeze. Across the continent, the same story is playing out on riverbanks from the Rhine to the Po. Barges sitting idle, turbines slowing, and balance sheets taking a hit. This is a story about water, energy, and a gap in Europe's power system that has been quietly widening for years. Here's the thesis of this video. Record low water levels on the Danube and other major European rivers are directly forcing shutdowns like Hungary's nuclear plant, and are simultaneously curbing hydropower output, transport, and industrial activity across the continent. That's happening against the backdrop of an energy system that was already stretched thin, one where renewable capacity has grown fast, but the storage needed to back it up has not kept pace. Put those two things side by side. A physical, river-level crisis hitting nuclear and hydropower simultaneously, and a structural storage gap in the broader grid, and you get a picture of a European energy system being tested from multiple directions during the same period. We're going to walk through what's actually documented, what's still speculative, and why either way this matters for anyone watching Europe's energy security story. Let's start with the clearest, most concrete data point in this whole story. Hungary fully shut down its sole nuclear power plant for the first time due to record low water levels of the Danube River. This is a nuclear facility Hungary depends on, and it needs river water for cooling. When the Danube's water level drops far enough, the plant can no longer draw the volume of water it needs to operate safely, so it has to power down entirely. This isn't a partial curtailment or a scheduled maintenance window. It's a full shutdown, and it's the first time this has ever happened to this facility. That's a striking marker of just how extreme the drought conditions along the Danube have become, and it's a vivid, concrete illustration of how a climate and weather event can directly translate into an energy supply event. Hungary's nuclear shutdown isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of something much bigger. Record low water levels in Europe's major rivers have curtailed the transport of goods, reduced electricity output, and shrunk company earnings. Think about what that sentence actually covers. Transport. Rivers like the Rhine and Danube are major arteries for barges carrying coal, chemicals, grain, and industrial materials. And when water levels fall too low, those barges either have to carry lighter loads or stop moving altogether. Electricity output. Hydropower plants along these same rivers depend on sufficient water flow to spin their turbines, so lower river levels mean less hydroelectric generation feeding into the grid. And company earnings. Businesses that rely on river transport or river-cooled or river-powered operations are seeing measurable financial impacts show up in their results. 3 different economic channels, logistics, power generation, and corporate profitability, all being squeezed by the same underlying physical cause, rivers that don't have enough water in them. That's what's stoking fears about the broader economic impact of searing heat and erratic rainfall across the continent. Now let's zoom out from rivers specifically and look at the broader energy backdrop this is all happening against. The European Union has added significant solar and wind capacity over recent years to diversify its energy mix. That part of the story is a genuine success. But energy storage capacity has lagged behind that renewable buildout, and that mismatch is creating new vulnerabilities for the grid and for energy markets alike. In plain terms, it's one thing to generate a lot of solar and wind power, but if you can't store the surplus for when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, or, as we're seeing now, when a river runs low and takes hydropower and nuclear offline too, you're left with a grid that has less of a buffer against disruption. One assessment in our sourcing goes further, describing Europe as falling far behind on energy storage installation, exactly when it's most needed, as an opinion. A pointed characterization, but one grounded in the same underlying storage versus renewables gap. And there's a wider framing worth noting too. Europe's current situation is described in our sourcing as its 3rd energy crisis in 4 years, attributed to the region's over-reliance on imported fossil fuels. As an opinion, That's a characterization from the source material, not a number we're independently verifying, but it underscores how energy security has been a recurring structural concern for the continent, not a one-off event. Here's where we need to slow down and be careful, because it's tempting to draw a straight line connecting all of this into one tidy narrative. Rivers dry up, nuclear and hydropower go offline, and that exposes Europe's storage gap, worsening an already fragile energy security position. That connective story is a hypothesis, hypothetically. It is not something the evidence directly documents. Specifically, the claim that drought-driven nuclear and hydropower disruptions in 2026 are compounding a pre-existing structural energy storage gap in Europe is a hypothesis with a pending review status, hypothetically, meaning it has not been confirmed as an established sourced link. What we actually have are two separate, well-documented threads sitting side by side, one about rivers curbing transport, power output, and earnings, and another about renewables outpacing storage buildout more broadly. They may well be connected in a meaningful way. That's a reasonable hypothesis to hold, but our sourcing does not itself draw that causal thread. Treating them as definitively linked would be getting ahead of the evidence. Let's be explicit about the boundaries of what's established here. It is documented that Hungary's nuclear plant fully shut down due to Danube water levels. It is documented that rivers across Europe have curbed transport, power output, and earnings. It is documented that storage capacity has lagged behind renewable buildout across the EU. What is not documented is a specific causal chain tying the drought-driven shutdowns directly into the storage gap narrative as one unfolding crisis. The idea that these disruptions are actively compounding the structural storage gap remains a hypothesis still pending verification. We also don't have, in this sourcing, updated figures on exactly how much generation capacity was lost continent-wide, how long the Danube's low levels are expected to persist, or whether other nuclear facilities face similar cooling water constraints. The characterization of this as a third energy crisis in 4 years is presented as an opinion in our source material, not an independently verified count of discrete crisis events. Readers and viewers should treat the river disruptions and the storage gap as two real but separately documented phenomena occurring during the same period, rather than as one proving cause and effect story. So why should any of this matter to you, even if you don't live near the Danube? First, it's a preview of how climate-linked weather extremes can hit energy infrastructure in ways that don't show up on most people's radar, not through dramatic accidents, but through the quiet mechanics of cooling water and river flow. A nuclear plant shutting down because a river got too low is a new kind of vulnerability for energy planners to account for. Second, the ripple effects touch ordinary economic life. Transport of goods, electricity output, and company earnings are all real-world channels through which reduced river levels translate into higher costs and tighter supply somewhere down the line. Third, the storage gap conversation is genuinely important on its own terms. Europe has done real work adding solar and wind capacity, but without enough storage to smooth out the gaps, the system remains more exposed to any kind of disruption, weather-driven or otherwise. Whether or not this particular drought event is the specific trigger connecting to that storage story, the underlying vulnerability the storage gap represents is well documented and worth watching closely as Europe continues its energy transition with closely. This is a story we'll keep following on the source ledger, because the pieces here, drought-stressed rivers, nuclear and hydropower dependent on water levels, and a storage gap that hasn't closed, are all still developing. If you want to understand how energy security actually gets tested in practice, not in theory, this is exactly the kind of story worth tracking closely, rather than reacting to with alarm. Subscribe to the source ledger if you want clear-eyed breakdowns of energy stories like this one, separating what's documented from what's still speculative. And if you have thoughts on where this storage gap goes next, drop them in the comments. We read them, and they shape what we dig into next.